Donald Trump thought he could silence Jasmine Crockett with a jail threat. But what happened next turned the nation upside down. The cameras were already rolling, the air so thick with tension it felt like every breath carried history with it. Journalists huddled shoulder to shoulder, phones out, eyes locked, waiting for the explosion they sensed was coming. The chatter in the room wasn't casual. It was electric, like the buzzing before a storm tears open the sky. And then he said it. With that familiar sneer, with that performative arrogance, Trump hinted at a punishment meant to break her spirit. Jail. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The weight of the word dropped heavy, a calculated threat meant to echo far beyond those four walls. For a moment the room froze. Some gasped, some smirked, others scribbled furiously into notepads as though the ink itself was on fire. Crockett didn't flinch, not even a blink. That's what shook people the most, because everyone in that room had seen others fold under the shadow of Trump's threats. They had seen politicians stumble, backtrack, bow. But here she was, unbothered, her silence louder than his threat. She didn't move, but somehow the energy shifted. It was no longer his stage. It was hers. Outside, news tickers lit up. Headlines formed in real time. Trump threatens jail. Crockett under attack. And a nation of viewers glued themselves to screens, rage and anticipation colliding in their chests. Was this going to be the end of her rise or the beginning of something far bigger? Trump leaned back, smug, convinced he had won the moment. The villain basked in his own theater, believing fear was still his most potent weapon. But what he didn't know was that the silence he mistook for weakness was something else entirely. It was calculation. Because Jasmine Crockett wasn't rattled. She wasn't cornered. She was sharpening, the kind of sharpening that only a lifetime of fighting uphill battles can teach you. And when she finally opened her mouth, it wouldn't just be a response. It would be a rupture, a seismic crack that would make even Trump regret the words he had just spoken. But Crockett's reply? It would leave Trump stunned, and America talking for weeks. Why would Donald Trump target Jasmine Crockett? Why single her out with the kind of threat usually reserved for his most dangerous enemies? The answer, as always with Trump, was about control. For years, his weapon of choice hadn't just been insults or lawsuits. It was intimidation, jail threats, smear campaigns, the looming shadow of legal machinery bent to his will. To silence critics, to send a message, oppose me and I will crush you. But Crockett was different. She wasn't a seasoned insider who had grown comfortable playing political theater. She wasn't someone who built a career by swallowing her words to stay in line. No, she was the kind of opponent Trump hated most. A fearless truth-teller, unpolished, unafraid, and unwilling to bend. Every time she stood at a podium or in a hearing room, she dismantled the performance of power with a sharp tongue and an authenticity that resonated with ordinary people. And Trump, for all his bluster, knew how dangerous authenticity could be. This wasn't just a clash of two personalities. It was a collision of two Americas. On one side, Trump, the embodiment of arrogance, privilege, and entitlement. On the other, Crockett, the face of struggle, grit, and resilience. She didn't just speak for herself. She spoke for the people Trump dismissed, the communities he tried to intimidate into silence. Every word she uttered carried the weight of those who had been told for generations to stay in their place. And that is precisely why he went after her. Because in her, Trump saw something he could not control. He saw the power of someone unafraid of him, and that, to a man built on fear, was intolerable. So he reached for his sharpest blade, the threat of prison. It was meant to cut deep, to wound not just Crockett but anyone watching who dared think of standing up. But the threat didn't land the way he expected. Instead of shrinking, Crockett sat in that room like a storm gathering its strength. Trump's arrogance was loud, but her silence was deafening. And outside those walls, people were already starting to whisper. Could this be the moment? Could this be where Trump finally miscalculated, where his old tactics met someone who simply refused to bow? The tension built like a drumbeat. Commentators speculated, allies cheered, critics sneered, and the audience watching knew something monumental was about to unfold. Because this wasn't just a fight over words, it was a test of whether fear still ruled, or whether dignity could stand unbroken in the face of power. And the truth was clear. Crockett wasn't just defending herself. She was carrying the weight of every voice Trump had tried to muzzle, every critic he had tried to bury. That's what made this moment electric, what made every second feel like history being written in real time. What she said in that moment would not only save her, it would put Trump on the defensive like never before. Donald Trump's story has always been painted in gold, but behind the shine was something far darker, an obsession with domination. From the gilded towers of Manhattan to the Oval Office, his weapon of choice was never just rhetoric, it was intimidation. Where others built alliances, Trump built fear. Where others led with conviction, Trump wielded threats like a hammer, pounding down on anyone who dared to stand in his way. His arrow, Gantz, was more than personality. It was strategy. Trump understood that if you kept people afraid, they would hesitate. They would think twice before challenging you, before speaking too loudly, before daring to defy. Fear was his brand, and nothing proved that better than his long, public history of trying to turn the machinery of law into a personal weapon. He had done it before. Critics who embarrassed him were branded enemies of the state. Political rivals were painted as criminals. Journalists were ridiculed. Lawsuits dangled like swords above their heads. It was a pattern as old as his career itself. Take the institutions meant to serve the people and twist them into instruments of revenge. The message was always clear: oppose me, and I'll come for you. And it worked. For years, powerful voices in Washington and beyond learned to tread carefully. Some compromised to survive. Others fell silent altogether. It wasn't just Trump's wealth that terrified them. It was his willingness to weaponize every resource at his disposal. His gilded empire gave him lawyers, platforms, connections, an endless arsenal of pressure points. Against that, what chance did an ordinary critic have? That was the contrast. Trump stood for the privileged fortress, the idea that money could bend rules, buy silence, erase accountability. On the other side stood the working-class voices he so often mocked, the communities dismissed as weak or irrelevant. Intimidation versus courage. Gold-plated threats versus lived resilience. The imbalance of power was staggering, and for a long time it seemed unshakable. But intimidation, no matter how powerful, carries a fatal flaw. It creates cracks. Because fear doesn't last forever. Every bully eventually overplays his hand, and every empire of intimidation eventually cracks. Trump's record of attempting to jail critics was filled with such overreach. From chants of "lock her up" hurled at Hillary Clinton, to veiled threats against prosecutors who dared investigate him, to angry outbursts directed at judges, Trump returned to the same playbook again and again. Jail wasn't just a punishment in his eyes, it was a stage prop, a tool to remind the world that he could make lives vanish with a word. Yet with each threat, the spectacle grew thinner. Each new target seemed less like a criminal and more like a witness standing in his way. Each attempt to silence drew more attention to the voices he wanted erased. Instead of shrinking the opposition, he inadvertently spotlighted it. The very thing he tried to bury became harder to ignore. And that is where Jasmine Crockett entered the story. Unlike seasoned rivals who carried the baggage of years in Washington, Crockett was unafraid of the gold-plated armor Trump wrapped himself in. She didn't have the insulation of wealth. She didn't have decades of insider deals to protect her. What she had was grit, a tongue sharp enough to cut through noise, and the courage to look directly at the man who thrived on intimidation and not blink. For Trump, that was dangerous, because his playbook required fear. Without it, he was exposed, not as invincible, but as desperate. And desperation has a way of showing itself. His threats against Crockett weren't just the same old tactic. They were louder, harsher, more reckless. They revealed a man running out of moves, leaning harder on the same trick because it was all he had left. And this time the audience wasn't buying it. People watching could sense it. The swagger was beginning to look like a mask, the threats more like hollow echoes than thunder. The empire of intimidation that had kept critics cowed for years was beginning to falter, because for the first time in a long time, someone wasn't afraid. That was the danger Jasmine Crockett posed. Not just her words, not just her defiance, but her refusal to play the game by Trump's rules. In her presence, the machinery of intimidation clanged and rattled, and suddenly, it didn't sound so strong. It sounded brittle. And brittle things, no matter how shiny, eventually shatter. Because every empire of intimidation eventually cracks, and Donald Trump was about to discover just how quickly his could crumble. Jasmine Crockett's story doesn't begin in the halls of Congress, under the glare of cameras, or within the swirl of national headlines. It begins where most American stories worth telling begin, with humble roots, grit forged through struggle, and a refusal to let the circumstances of birth dictate the scale of her destiny. She was never handed the gilded safety nets that cushioned men like Trump. Instead, she carved her way forward with persistence sharpened by necessity. Growing up, she saw firsthand what it meant to be overlooked, underestimated, written off before being given a chance. Those early lessons didn't break her. They hardened her resolve. They taught her that silence was not an option, because silence only preserves the power of those who thrive on intimidation. That belief guided her through law school, where she quickly earned a reputation for her relentless preparation and sharp tongue. While others preferred to glide politely through the system, Crockett made waves. She took on cases that many avoided, cases defending the vulnerable, the marginalized, the forgotten. Her courtroom presence was electric, her cross-examinations ruthless but precise. Judges and opposing counsel alike recognized the rare quality in her. A combination of intellect and fearlessness, the ability to slice through noise and land on truth with undeniable clarity. But the path wasn't easy. Taking up those fights meant making sacrifices. It meant working longer hours than anyone else, pouring energy into clients who couldn't always pay, and standing alone in rooms where every voice was against her. She lost friends along the way, people who couldn't understand why she chose the hard road when easier ones were available. She sacrificed comfort for conviction, and though the weight was heavy, she carried it with the pride of knowing her battles mattered. That sharp tongue, so often criticized by opponents, wasn't just style. It was survival. It was her way of refusing to be dismissed, of demanding space where others tried to push her out. When she clashed with opponents in courtrooms or political chambers, she did it with the authenticity of someone who wasn't playing a role. She wasn't chasing headlines, she was chasing justice. And people felt that. Her words struck deeper because they came wrapped not in calculation, but in lived experience. When she eventually rose to Congress, it wasn't because she was the chosen candidate of the powerful. It was because people in her community saw themselves in her. They saw the fighter who had been in the trenches, who had walked the streets they walked, who understood what it felt like to be unheard. She wasn't polished by Washington standards. She didn't have the glossy donor networks or the carefully manicured sound bites. What she had was authenticity. And in an age of performance politics, that was revolutionary. Her presence in Congress quickly made waves. She wasn't afraid to clash with colleagues, even within her own party, when principles were on the line. She wasn't afraid to call out hypocrisy, arrogance, or corruption, no matter who was wearing it. Clips of her fiery exchanges began to circulate online, spreading far beyond the walls of Washington. People shared them not because I were staged moments, but because they rang true. She spoke the way people wished they could speak if given the mic. And that sharpness, that refusal to play nice when dignity was at stake, painted a target on her back. Opponents sneered, pundits mocked, some tried to reduce her to caricature. But Crockett didn't bend. She embraced the criticism as proof that she was being heard. She wore it as armor, reminding herself that the powerful never waste energy attacking the irrelevant. Her journey became emblematic of something larger. She wasn't just one woman in Congress. She became a symbol of those long silenced. She represented the communities told to wait their turn, the voices drowned out by wealth and privilege. Her story was their story, and with every clash, every moment she stood alone, she reinforced the idea that dignity doesn't come from permission. It comes from persistence. But the cost was real. Nights spent away from family, endless scrutiny, threats from those angered by her defiance. There were moments of doubt, moments where the weight of it all threatened to overwhelm. Yet even then, she held fast to the same conviction that had carried her from those humble beginnings. Silence helps no one. And so when Donald Trump, with his empire of intimidation, tried to cast his shadow over her, she didn't cower. Because she had been standing alone for most of her life. She had been sharpening her resolve in battles far from the cameras, long before his name entered her orbit. She had weathered worse storms than a bully's threat. That was what Trump failed to see. He thought his wealth, his bluster, his history of silencing critics would be enough. But Jasmine Crockett's life had trained her for this moment. Every sacrifice, every lonely fight, every clash where she refused to be silenced had built her into exactly the kind of opponent he couldn't intimidate. And that life story, the grit, the authenticity, the unbreakable will, would soon fuel the takedown heard around the world. The moment had finally arrived. What began as whispers in the corners of the media cycle was now center stage, playing out live, every camera locked in, every microphone hot. Donald Trump, seizing the moment with the arrogance of a man who had long mistaken fear for respect, went on the offensive. His voice filled the chamber like a storm, booming with accusations that leapt from one falsehood to another. Words like corrupt, unfit, and criminal shot from his mouth with deliberate venom, crafted not to prove a point, but to wound, to humiliate, to brand Jasmine Crockett with the scarlet letters of his choosing. He interrupted before she could speak. He leaned forward, jabbing at the air with his finger, barking over her attempts to respond. Each threat was more brazen than the last. Innuendos of indictments, promises of investigations, the looming specter of jail time dangled like a guillotine. The arrogance wasn't subtle. It was a show of power, a performance meant to make her buckle beneath the weight of his theater. But Crockett didn't. She sat still, her posture firm, her eyes steady. She didn't meet his interruptions with flustered defenses or desperate attempts to fight fire with fire. Instead, she let him speak. Every insult he hurled, every baseless accusation, she absorbed with a calm that unsettled him more than any outburst could have. She knew the value of silence, of letting an opponent exhaust himself until the weight of his own words became too heavy to hold. And the room noticed. What began as murmurs of approval from Trump's allies slowly shifted into uneasy silence. His voice, once commanding, began to sound less like strength and more like desperation. His interruptions, once intimidating, started to feel like noise. On the other side of the room, Crockett's stillness grew louder by the second. She wasn't just enduring the barrage, she was weighted, watching, sharpening. Narration thickened the air. This wasn't just a clash of words, it was a collision of two worlds. One built on entitlement and intimidation, the other on dignity and resolve. Trump's accusations spiraled, his threats circled back on themselves, and yet Crockett's expression didn't change. To the audience, it became clear. He was rattled by her calm. The longer she held her silence, the more unhinged he seemed. Social media feeds lit up in real time. Clips of Trump's interruptions went viral within minutes, captions flashing, "Unhinged." "Losing control." Viewers across the country leaned in, sensing that something unprecedented was about to happen. This wasn't the usual spectacle where Trump dictated the tempo. This time the rhythm was shifting, slowly but unmistakably, in Crockett's favor. And then came the moment. Trump, red-faced, pounded his fist against the table, launching into yet another tirade about sending her where she belongs. The words hung in the air, thick with menace. His supporters nodded, but even among them, the enthusiasm had dulled. The phrase didn't land as thunderous truth. It landed as a threat too far. Crockett tilted her head, eyes narrowing ever so slightly. She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't flinched, hadn't taken the bait. Instead, she leaned back in her chair for a breath, as if she was deciding whether this was the time to unleash what she had been holding back. The tension was unbearable. The silence in that chamber was unlike any silence before. Even Trump, realizing he had reached the peak of his rant, slowed. For the first time, the spotlight that had been his by sheer force began to feel shaky, unstable, fragile. And then, Crockett moved. She leaned forward, her voice still unspoken but her intent clear, and the entire world leaned with her. In that instant, it didn't matter what Trump had said or how loud he had screamed. The stage no longer belonged to him. It belonged to her. And then, Crockett leaned forward and the world held its breath. The room was quiet enough to hear the faint hum of the cameras. All eyes were fixed on Jasmine Crockett as she leaned forward, hands folded, gaze unshaken. The barrage from Trump still hung in the air. Threats, accusation, interruptions. But suddenly the momentum had shifted. For the first time, it was clear. He had spoken too much, and now it was her turn. When she opened her mouth, her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was steady, razor-sharp, every word measured like a surgeon's incision. "Mr. Trump," she began, pausing long enough for the silence to thicken, "you love to talk about law and order, yet time and again you found yourself on the wrong side of both." Gasps rippled through the chamber. The first cut was clean, precise, and it drew blood. Trump shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening, but Crockett wasn't done. She leaned in closer, voice calm, almost conversational. "You call me corrupt? Let's talk about corruption. Because last I checked, corruption isn't standing up for the people who put you here. Corruption is using the presidency to line your own pockets. Corruption is threatening jail time for anyone who dares to disagree with you." The murmurs grew louder now, a current running through the crowd. Journalists glanced at one another, already scribbling the headline, "Crockett Strikes Back." Trump's lips curled into the half-smile he wore when he felt cornered, but the act didn't sell. His hands fidgeted, fingers tapping on the table as if trying to drown out the sound of her words. Crockett pressed forward, her voice rising just slightly, enough to cut through the tension. "You say I'm unfit? The truth is you've been terrified of women like me your entire life. Women who don't bow, women who don't play by your script, women who won't be silenced no matter how loud you shout." The audience broke into murmurs again, this time more low, like a low roar. Trump opened his mouth to interrupt, but Crockett raised a hand, her eyes locking on his with a calm authority. "You've had your turn, now it's mine." The effect was electric. The chamber stilled, the weight of her command undeniable. Even Trump, so used to steamrolling opponents, leaned back in his chair, momentarily stunned. She seized the silence. "You dangle jail like it's your crown jewel. But let's be clear, the only person in this room facing more indictments than campaign promises is you." The eruption was instantaneous. Gasps, laughter, even scattered applause broke through. Cameras zoomed in on Trump's face as the smugness evaporated, replaced by a flush of red climbing his cheeks. He waved his hands as if to dismiss her, but his gestures betrayed agitation, not control. Crockett, unbothered, delivered the next blow. "You want to talk about where I belong? Let me tell you something. I belong exactly where the people sent me. And unlike you, I didn't need lies, threats, or fear to get here. I earned it, every single step." Applause swelled louder now, no longer scattered but rolling across the room in waves. The sound wasn't just support. It was vindication, the audience rewarding her courage with their own voices. Trump shifted in his chair, tugged at his tie, glanced around as if searching for backup that wasn't coming. His interruptions came shorter, weaker. "Wrong, fake news," he muttered, but the words sounded small, hollow, drowned out by the momentum that had clearly swung against him. Crockett leaned in one last time, her tone almost pitying. "You thought threatening me would scare me. But you don't understand me, Mr. Trump. You don't understand people like me. Because when you fought your whole life just to be heard, just to stand, a bully's threats don't break you. They build you." The room erupted again, applause now deafening. Phones lit up, journalists scrambled to capture every line, and social media exploded as clips spread in real time. Hashtags began to trend within minutes. Crockett vs. Trump, unbothered. Mic drop moment. Trump's composure was crumbling. His shoulders hunched, his eyes darted. He tried to laugh it off, to wave her words away, but it wasn't working. The once dominant figure now looked like a man desperately trying to claw back control of a stage he no longer owned. Crockett, sensing the end of her crescendo, prepared the final strike. She straightened her posture, let the applause die down, and spoke with the clarity of a verdict. "You came here thinking you could bury me with threats. But all you've done is bury yourself under your own record, your own fear, your own arrogance. And if you haven't realized it yet, let me make it clear. You don't intimidate me. You never will." The silence that followed was heavy, powerful. For a moment it seemed even the cameras paused, holding their breath for the weight of her words to land. And then the explosion came. Applause, cheers, even chants rose from the back of the chamber. It wasn't just a win, it was a coronation, a declaration that she had turned the tide. Trump slumped, visibly rattled, his performance shattered. His fists clenched, his lips pursed, his body language screaming frustration. He had launched a barrage meant to destroy her, but now it was his credibility unraveling under the spotlight. Crockett sat back, calm once again, her face betraying no gloating, no smugness, only resolve. She had said what needed to be said, and she knew the impact it carried. Trump had come to bury her, but now it was his credibility being lowered into the grave. The dust in that chamber did not settle into silence. It settled into meaning. Jasmine Crockett's words had cut through the storm, but what lingered was not the clash itself, it was the truth beneath it. For in her defiance, she reframed the confrontation into something larger than herself, something every listener could carry long after the cameras dim. She made it plain. Dignity is stronger than fear. Truth is stronger than lies. This was not about one politician against another. It was about every worker who had ever been told to keep quiet, every immigrant who had been told they didn't belong, every young dreamer who was warned that speaking up would only bring them trouble. Crockett stood as their mirror, showing that silence may feel safe, but it never makes you free. She did what the fearful dare not. She spoke with the authority of someone who knew that respect is not begged for. It is commanded by the sheer weight of one's truth. And in that moment, America saw something rare. They saw a leader who did not confuse arrogance with strength. Trump's voice had been loud, thundering, designed to intimidate. But Crockett's was steady, grounded, unshaken. Her composure was its own rebellion, her poise its own resistance. In a world where rage is broadcast like a weapon, she revealed the quiet revolution. That dignity itself can roar louder than insults. That message rippled outward. It wasn't just about the courtroom drama or the political feud. It became a parable. For centuries, the powerful have tried to silence the inconvenient, to bury the truth under fear. But history has always belonged to those who resisted, to those who stood unbent when bending was easier. Crockett's words became part of that lineage, echoing the voices of activists, freedom fighters, and everyday citizens who refused to be broken. She had turned the tables. Trump came armed with threats, with the full weight of intimidation. But in responding with dignity, she stripped that power away. Fear thrives only when it finds submission. In the face of calm defiance, it withers. That was the lesson, sharp and undeniable. The moment you refuse to bow, the giant towering over you begins to shrink. This was the resolution of the story. The realization that courage does not always look like shouting, that victory does not always look like domination. Sometimes the most powerful blow is delivered in the calmest tone. Sometimes the truest form of strength is the refusal to surrender your dignity. As the scene faded, Crockett stood not just as a congresswoman, not just as a voice against Trump, but as a symbol of what it means to represent the unheard, to channel the silenced, to remind a nation of its own ideals. She had shown America itself in the mirror, and for once, it liked what it saw. And yet, even as dignity claimed its place, the air still hummed with anticipation. For this was not the end. A counterpunch that powerful would not go unanswered. The question that now loomed was simple. If Trump had been rattled in this moment, how would he strike back next? Donald Trump came to silence her, to reduce her to a cautionary tale, a warning to anyone who dared challenge his throne. But instead, America witnessed something far greater. In that moment, dignity triumphed over arrogance, truth shattered deception, and courage stood taller than fear. Jasmine Crockett's voice did not just echo through that chamber. It echoed through the heart of a nation hungry for integrity. This was not just about a debate. It was about a test of whether intimidation still ruled, or whether resilience could rise and reclaim the stage. And when the dust settled, one truth rang clear. Trump may have raised his threats, but it was Crockett's composure that carried the day. If this moment stirred something in you, don't let it end here. Be part of the chorus that refuses to be silenced. Share this story. Subscribe to this channel. Add your voice to a growing movement that says, democracy belongs to the people, not to bullies. Every click, every share, every word of encouragement. It builds a wave that no empire of intimidation can withstand. Because history doesn't remember those who bark the loudest. It remembers those who stand firm, who rise in the storm, who prove that dignity is stronger than fear. And long after the noise fades, Crockett's stand will be remembered not as a clash, but as a turning point, a reminder that truth, spoken with courage, can still shake the earth. So ask yourself, when the next moment comes, whose side will you stand on? The side of fear or the side of dignity? The choice is yours, the movement is ours, and the story has only just begun.